I'm Dr. Brandon Haworth. I'm the director of the Graphics AI Design and Games Lab here at UVic. And today I'm hoping to talk about the problem of representing humans in simulations and how we might use those simulations to improve how we design buildings. And in particular, I want to talk about crowd simulation. So everyone here has most likely encountered crowd simulation at some point in their life. It's very likely for many of you this was in film, like Lord of the Rings, where it was used extensively to model massive and otherwise expensive battle scenes. More recently, we see examples of it in television and games, shows like Game of Thrones. But generally speaking, crowd simulation has been used extensively in art, animation, and film for at least 2 or 3 decades. The earliest form of something like crowd simulation was cellular automata, which are just and applied to things like species and epidemiology studies, which are very relevant now, of course. But in these representations, entities or characters or agents, however you want to think of them, are generally represented as cells on a grid. But today I want to focus on continuous agent-based modeling of crowds, where each agent is responsible for making its own decisions in complex environments. For example, what you're seeing right now are flocking agents with 3 simple rules, and they have a lot of emergent behavior. So they do really interesting things. And this is sort of the earliest form of this appearing in graphics research. It's called Boids by Craig Reynolds, and it was showcased in the 80s. It defined entities or agents with these simple rules. And despite their simplicity, you could produce these really compelling behaviors, like you might see with birds or fish or bats in nature. So more generally, crowd simulation, when we start talking about humans, it's obviously much more complicated than that. But what approach we've taken sort of historically is kind of similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which of course is a broad generalization that is somewhat problematic, but it's a relatively good way of breaking down how we've historically approached crowds specifically. So like Maslow's hierarchy, we sort of have this hierarchy of needs for agents of how we're going to model individual needs, basically. So you have several layers, basically, at the bottom of which is locomotion, or the actual production of movement, and then steering decisions, animation, context, and behavior. So basically, how we move around, how we make decisions about how we move around, and how we avoid sort of running into each other while doing that. And generally speaking, these are implemented as separate models that communicate in some way. They propagate actions, things to do down the hierarchy. Like the behavior might tell you to go to the grocery store now, and we'll animate a character steering around people and walking down the sidewalk on the way to going to the grocery store, and you're producing locomotion to do that. So what I want to focus on today, however, is those lower layers concerned with how we actually move. And typically, these can be thought of in their own 2 or 3 layers related to steering and locomotion and animation and so on. So given some environment definition, so in this image here, sort of the gray boxes, an agent or the entity we're representing, some human that we're simulating, can produce a global navigation plan. So they have some idea of how they're going to move throughout a space from one goal to the next. And this is generally just the shortest path between those 2 points that avoids going through the environment itself. And it's made up of local points along this long-term path. So at every time step, every time we do a new step in the simulation, we need to steer basically along that path. And we do something called local steering, or local steering and collision avoidance, as it's often referred to. And it tells the agent how to actually move along the path while avoiding collisions with the environment and other agents. So given all of these definitions, we can get something like the following: an agent trying to evacuate a small area and interact with each other and the environment as they do so. So the nice thing is, given this kind of definition, we've already seen how it can be used in the arts, but more recently, it's actually been applied to dynamic analysis of environments and the design of environments. On the left is an example of it being used to identify shortcuts people might take, and where high density gathering points might occur in dynamic situations where there's lots of people moving around. On the right is an example of it being used to analyze congestion in environments and environment transitions like escalators. So it's clearly a powerful tool because we can show how these environments may be used before we actually build them, or we can understand how problems are emerging in our already built environments. So for our team and for a lot of my work early on, we were interested in gaming and how we could combine this idea of crowd simulation and environments to procedurally design new environments at different difficulties. But game interactions are really complicated, so we used a really simplified model, just one layer basically of the crowd simulation model that we showed to estimate how difficult an environment was. And given that estimation, we could sort of automatically search all the possible spaces or configurations of a game to find particular designs of particular difficulties. So the neat thing is this could help designers create compelling levels automatically. And since that actually worked, in game design, we considered it for more challenging domains like evacuations. So here we ask the question, given that we know that this works, and given that there's some prior work in evacuation studies and fire evacuation studies, that obstacles in evacuations actually impact flow, maybe positively, maybe negatively, we could design an optimization problem and find the best or worst arrangement of obstacles like pillars or trash cans or designs in the environment. But the problem was we found that it depended on the model you chose in the simulation. So I could simulate this using 3, 4, 5 different models and get totally different results. So we started investigating this sort of like combinatorial, how many objects can we move, how different were the results given different crowd simulators. And we noted that crowd simulators generally, their underlying models tended to represent a particular type of crowd better than another, the one or the other. So the other thing was that it became clear that density in the simulation, so the more people you had a large impact on performance and emergent behaviors, things that people did like form lanes or kind of turn around each other. So we were able to define new algorithms based on this, where we just focus on really high density parts of the environment. And the neat thing is we were able to use this to speed up algorithms. Basically, we could, instead of searching a really complex space of where all the objects could go and how all the crowds could move, we could just search a few different samples and say, okay, we think this is going to be a high value design. And we found that it actually performed on par with our more expensive approach of searching all of these designs. And the neat thing is because it ran in near real time, for most common cases, we transitioned into this new area of making tools basically for an area of what we call predictive crowd aware environment design. So we can build environments that are aware of the crowds that are going to use them in the future. So we made a simple tool using this algorithm in an interactive way. So you could start with some environment design that you kind of parameterize. You say, I want something in these regions, but I don't know where. And you would iteratively analyze and adapt to how the crowd density changes in your design. And the system would place these obstacles and these design elements for you in the way that best interacted with the crowd, basically. So knowing this, we interviewed architects to understand how they actually use their design pipelines, their tools, and how we might interact with them. And we learned that it's largely linear. Once you have a starting point and you've kind of gone through the exploration and artistic side, you kind of move forward in a very linear way and reuse parts of the design you've already made. And in terms of automation design, we also learned that having a system tell you what to do was highly undesirable, just generally. People didn't like the idea of being told, okay, this is the right solution, because they're experts in design. So a singular solution removed the designer from the process. So we defined a new human in the loop way of doing optimization with a human at the same time. So we presented a bunch of candidates at every step that balance objectives that the designer has. And this changes how the design process works. Instead of it being linear, it's more like a tree of exploration, where at each step we branch out to various design possibilities. And we built a system to facilitate this so that architects could actually use it, and they could set up constraints for their design and move things around and build new environments. But it didn't actually use crowd simulation yet. This turned out to be really difficult to do because crowd simulation is very complex and sort of chaotic. So what we did do is have measures for accessibility, organization, and visibility in the environment. And this produced all kinds of really interesting designs. We asked people to use it, experts and non-experts. Here you see an example of an outcome before and after for a museum piece. And what we found is that it actually worked really well in terms of crowd simulation and these measures. It could produce these really high value designs, but also that they were really strange and unconventional in the sense that they weren't necessarily symmetric. The hallways were different shapes than you might imagine, but they actually were easier to navigate in interesting ways. But we still need to like sort of close this loop. So we have all these tools to design environments, but we wanted to use actual crowd simulation. The problem is you might end up running hundreds of simulations. It's very hard to understand and bring together all of that information from hundreds of simulations. So we also identified the issue of, okay, well, if people are running simulations and there's a designer making a building, what does it mean to be a part of that design process? So we found that generally when interviewing architects that the design process is actually largely disconnected from the community it serves when it comes to architecture and building design. In fact, most of the decisions and considerations made are made from the point of view of a stakeholder, usually an investor or something like that, and the architect and their expertise. So we constructed a gaming-based platform to facilitate co-design. And I've heard co-design a few times during the event today, which is fantastic. I think it's the right way to go, where you incorporate the actual users into the process. And here, basically, we reimagined design problems as puzzles, architects as puzzle makers, and the community as players. And the players could use those crowd simulations to understand their designs. And the design score was basically based on how well those simulations completed some task. So we found that, generally speaking, single players who were just playing the game on their own actually outperformed expert-based designs, and that multiple players sort of playing together either cooperatively or competitively actually outperformed both expert-based designs and single players. So the culmination of this work was that we could do this. We could actually base designs on crowd simulation, but it brought up many important questions. I think the most concerning one is who is actually represented by these simulations. So for example, in this gaming-based setting, if a player doesn't actually see themselves represented in the crowd simulation, how does that impact attrition rate for the community in the co-design process? And more importantly, if designs are predicated on crowd simulations and those crowd simulations aren't representative, then those designs might not be representative. So if we revisit this approach, it's kind of too simple. Again, like I mentioned before, I showed you this pyramid, and at each layer, generally, there's some goal or action that propagates downwards. And near the bottom, we have models for moment-to-moment decisions that we call local steering and collision avoidance. But the reality is actually steering and locomotion are often decoupled. They're not tied together. They're completely separate from each other in terms of models. And there's some communication in terms of like high level, like I want to do this in terms of steering, please animate this in terms of what I just said I want to do. And it produces plausible results. But if you look really closely at crowd simulation, there's lots of weird artifacts that are very non-human. And it turns out it's partially because we're representing humans as particles and their rules as these very simple rules. And the reality is that if we look even at just normative human bipedal locomotion without considering any non-bipedal mobilities or system mobilities or gait disorders and anything like that, we'll quickly see that the reality is much more complex. In this picture, we just begin to identify the core issue here. Locomotion is a product of complex sensory motor control loop, and it's often highly personal, everywhere from personality to our mobility itself. So in our standard models, if we look closely at the literature, we have a handful of different approaches that kind of can be binned into a couple of different areas, including data-driven areas and so on. But the most popular ones used in these tools, because they're very fast, are physically based approaches and velocity-based approaches. And it turns out that these physically based approaches are really easy to implement and efficient. They're really nice. They're used quite often, but they can produce compelling behaviors, but they can be susceptible to unnatural movement, things humans don't actually do. And the velocity-based models similarly are easy to implement, very fast, and very useful, but they're almost too perfect for human simulations. And part of that is because they're based on robotics research. They're actually moving like a robot on purpose, mostly because we can guarantee using these velocity-based models that there will be collision-free movement, essentially, which is really important in robotics. So to address these shortcomings, we find we can build biomechanics-based models. And we want to build these models in such a way that they look natural and reproduce actual behaviors humans produce. And we also want the underlying representation to go beyond that single particle representation of a human as a circle, basically, and take into account more nuances in the human shape as we walk. And we can do that by planning footsteps through time, basically. This approach produces really compelling simulations of biomechanically sound agents or representations of humans. And it means that the results have a very high fidelity, including motions like sidestepping and tight packing and high densities, which is really important for simulation. So it brings up the question of where these biomechanics actually impact steering, because we have how we make actions, how we avoid collisions, and the emergent properties of crowds. So to support this research, I created a system for actually detecting how people step in motion capture databases. And it turns out if we look at people who have what we'll call temporal gait asymmetry, or what we identify typically qualitatively as a limp, that these types of steps separate very well when we plot out the dimensions that describe footsteps, basically. That normative steps are very different from non-normative steps. So we know that the action space is diverse. And then we find that if we model those action spaces for, say, in this case, post-stroke gait asymmetry, that the actual simulation is very different between these different types of models. And what we're showing here and what we're looking at is, are lower speeds a good proxy for other mobilities like temporal gait asymmetry, which is common in crowd simulation? To, say, model a person who has a gait disorder, often what we'll do is just reduce their speed and we'll still use this single particle model. So this is the problem we're trying to address, basically. And if we look at the space that a particle traverses, that circle representation traverses in a simple task. So in this case, we're just looking at a line, basically, from above, what that particle moves through in space over time. It's very simple, right? The shape is just a very straight and rectangular, looks kind of like a capsule. But if we do the same thing, we look at above, the space that we traverse as humans while we're stepping, it's much more complex depending on how we walk. If we have a temporal gait asymmetry versus if we walk slower, versus if we walk slower with a temporal gait asymmetry, and so on. And we can look at this at the crowd level. How do these different types of stepping patterns impact the emergent crowds when we have lots of people walking together? And we can break up, say, a simple environment like this one. This is the one-way hallway egress we saw before, so people exiting a hallway. We get a lot of data from this, and if we look at it qualitatively and break down all of this data, what we end up seeing is that we get very different results. So we can summarize this as two problems. Basically, that environments are built for able-bodied users typically, and that these environments play a role in long-term disablement processes, and that diverse mobilities, including age and age-related changes in gait, are not well represented in the tools we use to design and evaluate these. So in our modeling approach, we have two issues basically to improve on this. We have ad hoc and expertly designed rules don't describe the full range of possibilities with humans, and the underlying representation of the human in the model is very simplified. So what we've been doing is adapting this and approaching this problem with reinforcement learning, which is kind of a complex method of learning actions from environments. And the neat thing is, we showed that we tried to basically build a simulator that could reproduce those particle methods from before. And we were able to reproduce the state of the art using reinforcement learning. And we did this by basically making agents that could observe the world and how it changes around them over time. And we get these really neat results where we can simulate diverse crowds, but diverse only in their speed. So our hope in the future, and I'll wrap up really quickly here, is that we can build higher fidelity crowds than these single particles. We know we can do single particle, we know we can do multi-particle with footsteps, but we want much higher fidelity. So we can simulate things like mobility aids, cooperative mobility like guide dogs and personal support workers and things like that, eventually things like wheelchairs and so on. And we want to do that at the level where we're building in these simulations into environment analysis and big crowd simulation. There's a lot of problems with this. Obviously, particles and humanoids are very different from each other. They're going to produce linear paths or nonlinear paths. And we have some solutions for this, which are somewhat complicated. But the neat thing is that we can learn to walk, and we can learn to walk with other people by training these high fidelity models to do that. And I'll just wrap up quickly because I think I'm out of time.
Yeah.
But the neat thing about this model is it's morphology agnostic. And in the future, we're hoping to collect more data from more diverse mobilities to learn models for more diverse mobilities. And I'll wrap up there. Thanks so much for the time. And I'll just recognize that a lot of my work is supported by Insert Discovery Grant, and I have many collaborators from York University, Rutgers, University of Montreal, and the UHN Toronto Rehab Institute, and of course support from ILA. So thank you for listening.